Welcome! Today, we are going on a journey to unpack a massive story of change in rural India. You know, you often hear about farmers protesting, but how does a traditional peasant, someone whose life is built around survival, become a protester on the front lines? Well, we're going to dig into the huge economic shifts, the big development projects, and the crises that have led to this powerful, long legacy of resistance. All right, let's get into it.
So here's our game plan. First, we need to ask, who exactly is a peasant? Once we've got that down, we'll look at two huge forces of change, the arrival of the market economy and what gets called development. Then we'll see how these two forces combine to create a pretty devastating agrarian crisis. And finally, we'll explore the incredible history of resistance that rose up in response.
Okay, first things first. To really understand this whole story, we have to be absolutely clear about who we're talking about. The peasant is the central character in this entire narrative, so nailing this definition is, well, it's everything.
It seems like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? But the answer is actually very specific, and it's the key that unlocks everything that follows. See, it's not just anyone who works the land. So let's get a really clear definition. Here's a foundational definition from A.L. Kroeber. The key idea here, the thing to really grab onto, is that peasants are a part society. What does that mean? It means they're rural, for sure, but they're not totally cut off. They are structurally connected to larger towns and cities. So they aren't completely self-sufficient like some isolated tribal groups might be, but they still have their own distinct local culture.
Now this is where it gets really interesting, and this is a crucial distinction. Eric Wolf draws this sharp line between a peasant and what's called a primitive cultivator. So both of them farm to survive, right? That's what's meant by replacement and ceremonial funds. But the peasant has this third critical burden, something called a fund of rent. This is the surplus, the extra they produce, that they are forced to give up to a non-farming ruling class. It's this power imbalance, this built-in subordinate relationship that truly defines what it is to be a peasant.
And, okay, one more vital distinction to lock in, the difference between a peasant and a farmer. For a peasant, the main goal is subsistence. It's about feeding their family. They produce for themselves first. They might sell some cash crops, but that's usually just to buy the things they can't make themselves. A farmer, on the other hand, sees agriculture as a business. It's all about profit, reinvestment, and it's driven entirely by the market. This difference in mindset is a complete game changer.
All right, so we have our picture of the traditional peasant who's totally focused on subsistence. Now let's introduce a force that's going to completely turn that world upside down, the arrival of the modern market economy.
And just look at the sheer scale of this change. This chart is staggering. It shows agriculture's slice of India's GDP just plummeting after the 1991 economic reforms. Think about it. From over a quarter of the entire economy in 1990 down to just over 10% by 2016. That is a massive fundamental shift away from agriculture as the backbone of the economy.
So what exactly is this market economy we're talking about? Well, it's a model built on liberalization and globalization. Its whole logic is about producing a surplus to make a profit, competing like crazy, and plugging into these huge global markets. You can see right away how this is the polar opposite of the peasant's subsistence-first mindset we just talked about.
And you know, this wasn't just some abstract idea. It was pushed forward by very specific policies. Rules on leasing land, they were loosened. Big corporations, both national and multinational, were encouraged to come into rural areas. The entire focus shifted from feeding local communities to growing crops for export. Basically, the doors were thrown wide open for market forces to come in and completely shape rural life.
At the same time the market was moving in, another powerful force was at play: huge, large-scale development projects. But as we're about to see, this was truly a double-edged sword, bringing both the promise of progress and the very real danger of dispossession.
On the one hand, you had these massive projects, dams, factories. They were celebrated as temples of modern India, right? They were symbols of national progress. But on the other hand, for the people actually living on that land, the reality was often displacement and poverty. The benefits tended to flow to the cities and to industry, while rural communities were the ones who paid the price, losing their land, their homes, and their livelihoods.
The sociologist Michael Cernia actually came up with this really powerful framework to help us understand these consequences. He showed that when people are displaced by development, it isn't just about losing a house. No, it sets off a whole chain reaction of terrible risks. You become landless, then jobless. You can lose access to common lands. Food becomes insecure, and entire communities are just torn apart. Each risk feeds the others, creating a devastating downward spiral.
So what happens when you combine the intense pressure of a new market economy with the hugely disruptive force of these large-scale development projects? The result is what we now know as India's unfolding agrarian crisis.
This slide really lays out the tragic recipe for how this crisis happens. It's like a domino effect. It starts with the state pulling back on investment and official credit. This forces farmers to take loans from private moneylenders at incredibly high interest rates. Now, to have any hope of paying those loans back, they switch from stable food crops to really risky cash crops like cotton. But that makes them totally vulnerable to global price swings and bad weather. And when a crop fails, well, that's when the debt spiral begins. A spiral that often ends with them losing everything.
And the human cost of this crisis, it's just captured perfectly in this quote from the journalist P. Sainoff. When livelihoods in the countryside completely collapse, people have no choice but to leave. This isn't people moving for a better opportunity. This is migration born out of desperation, a direct result of this agrarian crisis.
But this story of crisis doesn't just end in defeat. Our final section looks at the powerful response from the ground up, how peasant and tribal communities have organized to fight back against these overwhelming forces. Now, before we look at some amazing examples, let's just quickly get our terms straight, because it helps to be precise. A protest is often a single, organized act of dissent. Resistance is the broader, ongoing struggle against a dominant force. And a movement is when that resistance becomes a sustained, organized campaign with a bigger goal. These terms help us see all the different ways that people fight back.
And what's so crucial to understand is that this resistance is not new. This timeline shows a long, unbroken legacy of struggle. It goes all the way back to things like the Coal Mutiny against the British in 1831, through the huge peasant uprisings of the 1940s, all the way to modern struggles like the Niyamgiri movement. This is a continuous thread that runs right through Indian history.
Let's just take a closer look at that Niyamgiri movement for a second. It is such a powerful modern example. Here, you had the Dongria Khan tribe organizing to protect their sacred hill, which is the absolute source of their identity and their survival from a massive multinational mining project. And their sustained, unified resistance, it was actually successful in the end. It's proof that collective action can challenge even the most powerful corporate and state interests.
So as we've seen, this is an ongoing story. The pressures from the market and from certain kinds of development, they haven't stopped. And that leaves us with a really critical question for the future. As these powerful forces continue to change and evolve, what new forms of resistance and solidarity will rise up to meet them? The next chapter of this story is being written right now.